Good afternoon. My name is Ed Richardson and I'm Keystone Tutors Managing Director. Welcome to our webinar on how to prepare competitive Oxbridge candidates. Keystone has for a while now been supporting schools through its in-school delivery, we call that Keystone Elective, in preparing students for Oxbridge and top universities. We do this in a variety of different ways and support schools in some or all of these things. Firstly, supercurricular learning, which boils down to guided reading and specialist knowledge development, admissions test preparation, like the LNAT or the TSA, and this is particularly relevant for Oxford and Cambridge, but also more general examinations like the LNAT or the TMUA. And also we help with interview preparation. So we do mock interviews and provide guidance and feedback. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two of our professional tutors, and they're both employed tutors for Keystone, and they've worked with schools. We have Florence here. So prior to joining Keystone and becoming a professional tutor, Florence worked at Oxford and was involved in the admissions process, so understands very much the kind of requirements and needs of the admissions process. And John, prior to life at Keystone, I worked with him and had the pleasure of being a school teacher alongside him. He has 20 years plus knowledge of helping students prepare for university, including Oxbridge. So we're in pretty good hands with respect to the knowledge that can be shared. In terms of how this is structured, we're going to design a sort of a conversation between John and Florence, and I'm going to ask a series of questions, and you're going to listen in to essentially our responses to them. What we're going to start with is thinking about the identification of Oxbridge candidates, and then we're going to move into the preparation. So let's start, Florence, with thinking about the nature of the candidate. Is there a particular profile of students that Oxford and Cambridge are looking for?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think the short answer to that is no, although obviously we all know that Oxbridge is about intellectual capacity, and those students with that passion, with that openness to new ideas, with that excitement about their subject. I think one of the great joys of interviewing, which I did over a number of years, is finding students who you perhaps don't expect with something really unique to offer. Although I do think that one quality that's often overlooked a bit when it comes to thinking about possible candidates, which is really important, is resilience. Because it's really important that students can not only cope with the pressure cooker that is Oxbridge, but might also thrive there, because it is such a highly pressured environment. So I think tutors are definitely looking for that, as well as intellectual capacity.
That makes a lot of sense. John, if I can come to you now, and I guess putting both hats on as a professional tutor, but also a school teacher for many years, is it the case that in the tracking of students through schools and the data that schools collect, we should simply be thinking about candidates in terms of those that would meet the minimum entrance requirements? Or is there more that we should be looking to in order to sort of encourage a child to apply for Oxford or Cambridge?
Yeah, I think initially, obviously, the academic profile is the key thing to be looking at. And, it's certainly the case that those entry requirements are a minimum. So candidates that are hitting that, yeah, feel free to apply. But it's often the case that many successful candidates are exceeding that kind of minimum entry requirement. And then, as Florence has kind of alluded to, there's obviously significant extension work done by the vast majority of students in terms of showing that ongoing independent drive to explore ideas beyond the scope of what they've been doing in the classroom. So as an initial identifier, academic kind of capacity is obviously the primary thing, but we're looking for students that kind of bring more to the table, as it were.
That's interesting. And I guess, a lot of what we're saying here won't be new to teachers. And also, I think the important point to note here is that statistics are released by Oxford and Cambridge every year. So you can see, what grades successful candidates do achieve. And to your point, a lot of students are far exceeding the minimum entrance grades as a requirement. And that's just one part of the process, clearly, is their sort of academic profile in terms of grades, because they're also assessing their interest, as you say, through things like the interview. Florence, if we can move on to thinking about kind of the other aspects, to what extent are Oxford and Cambridge interested in the non-academic achievements that a child or interests that a child might have?
Well, I think it can be quite surprising for parents and teachers to know that at Oxford and Cambridge, extracurriculars are not really taken much into account. They're a sort of a lucky add-on, if you like, which is very different to universities in America, you know, the Ivy League, for example, where sporting prowess is really valued, as we know, as well as other skills. So I think we would want to not discount students' skills, and certainly it's always a good idea, I think, for students to consider if they do have a particular skill or interest that's outside of their academic life that they want to pursue. They should definitely have a look at the colleges and see which one might be able to help them with that, offer them facilities, for example. We can consider, as an example of how this might work in Oxford, Oriel College, for example. It's a big rowing college. If you wanted to do rowing at Oxford, you might apply to Oriel, but they would not consider you unless you had a stellar academic profile, great interview, great submitted work. If you can offer them rowing as well, of course, they're going to welcome that with open arms, but that's not what they're primarily interested in you doing there.
Interesting. And I think that comparison to the American system is a really important one because they have a far more rounded view from what I understand, although I'm no expert in applying to US universities, whereas it seems that UK universities at large, but also Oxford and Cambridge particularly, are very meritocratically driven in terms of your academic level of interest. That's the real focus and the premise. Why is it that you want to study this particular subject? And what is it that your track record shows that means that you are a credible candidate to do so? John, just thinking more broadly then about guidance and advice, we will have teachers listening to this based around the world and even in the UK who perhaps don't have a huge amount of experience in preparation for Oxbridge candidates. How would you recommend that school teachers assess the appropriateness of their students, I guess above and beyond that just simple academic passport that no doubt they're developing over time?
I think fundamentally it comes down to classroom teachers having an understanding of who is in front of them. You know, we've all had experiences of that candidate that comes and asks the slightly problematic kind of probing question about something that's kind of well beyond the scope of the GCSE or A-level curriculum that we happen to be teaching them. You know, and it's exactly those sorts of questions that are kind of standing out as candidates that are clearly thinking about our subject and really passionate and clearly engaging in sort of wider reading. I think as well as, you know, the sort of wealth of opportunity that is out there. I'm thinking about things such as, you know, junior maths challenge, intermediate maths challenge, all of these sorts of competitions, academic competitions on and above, you know, the sort of what's happening in a classroom. I think that are showing a willingness to engage in these opportunities, be that, you know, when school is suggesting, oh, look, there's this thing coming up that you should be part of, or kind of asking independently, you know, how do I get involved in this? That's always a really good indicator of somebody that is or should be on the radar in terms of suggesting, look, have you thought about maybe applying to Oxbridge?
Thank you for that. I think, yeah, that personal drive and ambition and driving the process forward themselves rather than being driven, I think is a really key quality, as you say. Great. So let's move on to preparation. Hopefully identification there has been helpful. And I guess what I'd love for you both to share is, in your experience, the sorts of things that you think have worked well with respect to preparation. And I guess thinking about sorts of recommendations that teachers could employ, you know, with their students. John, so ideally, when would students start preparing for applying to Oxbridge? And can you give us an idea of what good in-school preparation might look like?
I think in reality, the earlier the better, really. You know, kind of the application process can include some really arduous exams depending upon the subject that you're applying to. And so providing students with opportunities in class to explore ideas that are beyond the scope of the curriculum, to encounter these sorts of academic, you know, challenging academic tests, I think is important in part of that process, but also in driving, you know, what they do from a GCSE and A-level preparation. I see lots of students that sort of come in the summer of, year 12 or the Easter of year 12 and think, oh, actually, I'd like to apply to Oxford or Cambridge. And by that point, it's a bit late in the game, you know. So I think really with the wealth of data that schools have in terms of academic tracking and, you know, kind of knowing your students in your classroom, really kind of thinking about year 10, year 11, actually those are good times to start kind of engaging students with the preparation process.
And I guess that preparation there is pretty broad. It's not, you know, specific preparation for the LNAT or a particular admissions test at that stage. It's just the exposure to that kind of wider, broader, deeper thinking. I guess schools have to balance that with the nature of standardized examinations like the GCSE and the IGCSE that's coming in year 11. But what we're saying here is this don't need to be substantial amounts of preparation, but little and often. And of course, schools are probably already doing that with sort of able, gifted, talented groups. But perhaps marking those students slightly earlier and then giving them the opportunity and exposure, as you say, to sort of those critical thinking, those sort of broader academic endeavours, which would look to develop many of the skills that Oxford and Cambridge and top universities in the UK would be looking for. Thank you for that. Okay, well, I guess let's think then. So I appreciate your point around the summer of year 12 being a bit late, and in an ideal world we'd start much earlier, as you've just said. I think it's probably fair to say that the majority of schools will start preparation in earnest in the beginning of the spring term in January of year 12, and they probably would look to have a sort of a 10-month run in. By that time, they'll feel that students have made the step up to IB or A level or whatever their sort of terminal examinations are going to be, and get a sense of kind of what predictions might look like. So let's delve into some of the key features. The importance of supercurricular learning beyond the exam syllabus is stressed, both by you guys, you've just mentioned that, and by universities. But what does this mean on a practical level, I guess? And if we can focus with STEM and then the languages and humanities. So Florence, perhaps if you start with the language humanities, that element, and then John will come to you for STEM.
Yeah, so I think it doesn't have to be under the banner of Oxbridge Prep. We can think about, generating intellectual activity in schools. We can think about helping students with their lifelong learning and their progress, with academic life for their whole life, if you like. And, the earlier that can begin, the better. And we're thinking about critical thinking, close analysis, argumentation, logic, rhetoric, all of these skills which are so useful for communicating ideas, for getting things down on paper. And I think it's just as we've been saying, we want to push students out there into the big wide world of ideas. We want to ground what they're doing in school in reality. So, they're not just sitting at a desk at home or at school. So if we consider, for example, The Wasteland, the T.S. Eliot poem, commonly taught for A-level English, often quite an ambitious text to teach students, and it can be really helpful to take it out of the classroom. So, for example, can you go on a school trip to Margate, for example, in the UK, which is a setting in the Wasteland where Eliot lived for a while? Can students read more dynamically, having been there or being there? There's a lot out there on Eliot at the moment because it was the centenary of the Wasteland not so long ago. Can you listen to a Radio 4 In Our Time special on the Wasteland and discuss it? Can you take students to a lecture run by the Eliot Society? Can you get students to really think about Eliot's sort of life and purpose, the purpose of literature, the point of writing, of doing an English degree? Eliot was a banker as well as a poet. Where do these students see their study of literature taking them in their kind of life story, if you like? So I think it's really about that bigger picture, that bigger world of ideas, which is going to really sort of supercharge understanding and learning, really.
I think that's a really good kind of explanation through one subject of the sort of different areas you might exploit with students to kind of develop their level of interest. John, can you give a kind of STEM example with that? I appreciate that in both of you, I've asked you huge areas of subjects, but I guess if you could just give an example, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think STEM is a really interesting one because obviously it's sort of this umbrella term that covers huge number of different fields. And in a lot of instances, schools aren't kind of providing a BTEC in engineering or GCSEs in engineering, and so when you're applying for an engineering degree, as a candidate, it's important to show that you've done your research in terms of actually, how do I know that this course is for me? How do I know it's not maths or physics? How do I know it's the applied stuff? So as schools, as classroom teachers, kind of keeping an overview of maybe what online courses are there for candidates to involve themselves in. As Florence is saying, can we take them on field trips to places so they get an appreciation of, okay, well, this is how these ideas are being applied in this particular field. So I think really it's about providing as many kind of immersive experiences as possible, suggesting reading lists for particular fields and things like that, and kind of having that as sort of openly accessible documents for students to get hold of, so they can come to it in a bit more of a guided way, but then ultimately be driving that process as well. So, that's just the first kind of stepping stone on the process that's kind of a bit more independently driven ultimately.
That's really helpful. Thank you both. I guess one of the key things where we add some value is those discussions, and essentially providing some sort of stimulus, and it may be provided by the school, as Florence said, they may have gone on a school trip, they may have been to Margate, but in reality, we might then within some of our supercurricular sessions give them an extract or a perspective on a poem, and then have a discussion around it. And it's the discussion which often is incredibly fruitful, because it encourages not only the interpersonal skills, the articulacy, of the academic level of conversational skill, but also then spawns out lots of other areas of interest and exploration, which students then, particularly students for Oxford and Cambridge, but as you say, Florence, not always, for those institutions, could then go and explore. And then by reflecting on that exploration they've done in the myriad of different ways we've just discussed, that is obviously central to something like the personal statement, but also the interview, which then demonstrates your genuine interest in the subject. And then interviewers, people reading a personal statement, can see that you're a candidate who is really committed to this subject. Okay, so I mentioned interpersonal skills there. How would you recommend that schools develop these, John? I think these are, I guess, above and beyond mock interviews to some degree. How would you recommend that they do that?
I think when you think about how courses are delivered at Oxford and Cambridge, there's that sort of tutorial system. The interpersonal skills are critical, being able to kind of listen, communicate, and deal with people maybe being critical about your viewpoint, or how you think about things. And so I think classrooms can be kind of set up in similar ways, actually promoting that idea of classroom discussion, creating spaces where people feel comfortable voicing their opinions and ideas, and candidates are being forced to develop those sort of softer skills of taking on board somebody else's position that might sort of be counter to theirs, for example. Again, I think it's giving students that kind of safety within a classroom, ultimately, that they feel that they can share their ideas and thoughts. Yeah.
Anything further to add, Florence?
I think John's absolutely right that we need to sort of generate these discursive skills. And I would say from my experience that actually these skills are really what help people get the absolute most out of the Oxbridge setting, with the small tutorial system, with the relationships they build. I think when I got to Oxford, I thought that what you needed to do was go and sit in the library for 12 hours, and that's how you were successful. But actually, I think you can see, looking at people's trajectories, looking at how successful people were within that academic field, that it's those people who develop those relationships intellectually and personally who really have the most success and the longest sort of trajectory of success. Those relationships are absolutely key. So it can't be underestimated, really, how important those, overestimated, how important those skills are.
I think the only thing I would add finally is just to say that how much time that takes. I think we all know, having worked in schools or with school students, is that expecting a child to suddenly be able to switch on to have a discussion to that kind of level and degree is quite a tall order, and a lot of students need that time. And to John's point, in an ideal world, you might start earlier in year 10, I guess, but even if you're starting in year 12, it's getting them that exposure to a discussion-based environment where they can be wrangling with these ideas or these thoughts, this material on a regular basis, which then means they're starting to kind of form a certain sense or a view, and then they can start to articulate that. And I think that practice, often interpersonal skills and the development of them, is linked directly with mock interviews. But the reality is actually to get to a level that you need to be at, where a mock interview in and of itself is going to be valuable, you need to have done quite a lot of development to get to that point. We would always encourage students to start earlier on the mock interview side, as you guys know. But I guess you're also developing mock interview skills, interpersonal skills through things like the supercurricular sessions where you're having those discussions and debates, around particular content in your area of interest with like-minded individuals. So it's an ongoing sort of feast, I guess, in many ways. And this goes back to your point, John, with that kind of personal ambition and drive. A student needs to want to navigate that way through that. And I guess to your point, Florence, Oxford and Cambridge have designed a system of admission, which means that they're really closely scrutinising that. And obviously students who tend to be impassioned are likely to do pretty well, or certainly convey that passion, which should put them in a really good position. Anyway, thank you both for sort of breaking that down and giving some snippets of really useful stuff. We will stop there, but this is a part of a much broader webinar series, so please do join us again.